The Podcast Theater brings 30-minute interviews with top voices in food safety, recorded live only for on-site attendees. You'll see them here before they're published for the digital audience. Plan your trip at foodsafetysummit.com.
All right. Well, welcome back, folks, to our Podcast Theater Live. And we're about to do another interview. And looking forward to this one because Brian Ronholm, Director of Food Policy from Consumer Reports, is one of my favorite people to talk to. And, it's good to see you again and to have you at the summit. And we last spoke on episode 164 of the Food Safety Matters podcast back in February of last year. And at that time, we talked about a whole lot of then current events from a consumer advocacy point of view.
Yeah.
We talked about the FDA Foods Coalition, heavy metals in baby foods, FDA's actions on food additive regulation, USDA's proposed salmonella rule for poultry, which has since been withdrawn, and other topics. And it feels like we're in a very different climate right now with the many changes made by the new presidential administration to the agencies and to regulatory actions between that time we talked in the podcast last year and now. So what are your thoughts on how the recent changes to the FDA workforce and structure will impact the agency's regulatory function and capabilities?
Yeah. Well, Adrienne, thanks for having me on again and for inviting me to be on. I will say that we're still all in the process of trying to figure out what this all means. Mm-hmm. We've had this initial wave of chaos and destruction with the deep cuts to resources, to deep cuts of personnel. Understanding that, some of those folks are being brought back, but it's still not clear kind of where the gaps are in terms of the infrastructure, both at FDA and USDA. So I think all stakeholders at this point, we're still trying to figure out where the gaps are going to be, what infrastructure and capacity they will have going forward. So there's still a lot of elements and variables that are unclear at this point.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you're also speaking on a session tomorrow on ensuring chemical safety in food processing. And as I mentioned, this is one of the topics we discussed on your podcast interview last year. And we've recently seen not only changes to FDA's regulatory approach with the new administration, but also increasing state legislation that is tackling additives and chemicals in foods. So as a food safety advocate, what are your thoughts on the current disparity between federal and state approaches to food additives regulation, particularly regarding the generally recognized as safe or GRAS designation?
Yeah, it's been a pretty steep disparity between federal action or inaction, if you will, compared to what's going on recently at the state level. And you have to remember that a lot of the activity that's been going on at the state level is a direct result of the frustration toward the FDA and their kind of long inability to really address these issues in a meaningful way. And there's a lot of reasons for that. FDA, especially on the food side, as we all know, has been chronically underfunded. When you look at the jurisdiction of the food supply that they have. And so they're chronically underfunded when it comes to really regulating and providing meaningful oversight. And as a result of that, there was this culture that's been established where a lot of these issues that deal more with on the chronic side and not on the acute side kind of gets pushed to the back burner. So like food chemicals, additives, food dyes, the GRAS system. There's this culture that have been established like, okay, we're going to push this aside. We're going to focus on the more immediate issues just based on our resources and capacity. And so states became very frustrated by that inaction. And that's why you've seen a lot of them try to step up and address these issues in a meaningful way and respond to consumer concerns. And GRAS is a perfect example of that. This is a system that has gotten out of hand, where you have this so-called secret GRAS process that allows manufacturers to introduce ingredients and chemicals in the marketplace without any thorough review by the FDA. So when you talk to consumers about that, it's really troubling from their vantage point. It's like, wait a second, I thought the FDA has the authority to review everything that goes into food, and come to find out that it's not true. And so that's one of those issues too that the states are taking up, that you've seen, where there are these bills that require some disclosure when it comes to secret grass. So yeah, ultimately it's trying to respond to consumer interest, to public health interest, when the FDA hasn't been able to.
And, as food safety professionals, how best can, the folks that are attending this conference and working in industry collaborate with state and federal regulators to address some of these shifting food additives laws?
Yeah, it's a matter of monitoring what's going on at the state level. I think one thing you will see when you look at all of the bills that are being worked on in the various states, there's a common thread. There is a common list of chemicals that they're all trying to address. So from the industry standpoint, you take a look at that and think, okay, clearly there is a most wanted list that consumer groups, public health groups are working on. What is that list? And do I have a product that includes that? And maybe it's time to think about pivoting away from those kind of most wanted chemicals that are on these lists, and trying to figure out, what are the best alternatives. In a lot of cases, we like to make the argument that a lot of those alternatives already exist and they're just as cost effective. That may not be right, and certainly, willing to have that discussion. But yeah, I think it's a matter of monitoring those lists that are at the states, because there is a common thread, and it might be best to try to move away from those.
Yeah, and when you think about, we talked about a patchwork of state legislation that is emerging when it comes to additives and chemicals in food. So
Right.
not only are manufacturers having to be concerned about formulations of products, but then we're seeing things with state movements toward some of these extended producer responsibility and programs of recycling content, things that are required, and so that affects your packaging. And your packaging obviously is something that protects your food. So we've got lots of different angles that are coming at manufacturers that they need to incorporate, and they're going to need to consider, how are we making our products? What are we putting these products in to be able to deliver them to consumers? How are consumers going to react to that? So
Yeah, no, Adrienne, that's a very fair point, and certainly understand from the perspective of industry that it is difficult to try to navigate the patchwork system that's going on at the state level. But at the same time, there is a common thread with the list of chemicals that we're targeting, and same with food packaging, with BPA and PFAS and phthalates, plasticizers. So understanding that the patchwork system can be difficult, but there's clearly a list of chemicals, additives that are being targeted. And if consistency is kind of that critical, I think it behooves the industry to figure out, okay, where are those, what are the common thread among what all of the states are looking for, and maybe look into whether it makes sense from a cost perspective to try to move away from those.
Yeah.
So,
And it's interesting because a lot of these targeted chemicals that we're talking about are chemicals that, for example, are banned for use in food in Europe.
Right.
And Australia, New Zealand. So
yeah, and that's what can be frustrating from a consumer standpoint, is that understanding that there are some colors and additives and chemicals that are allowed here but are banned elsewhere in the world, or severely restricted,
Right.
or requires a label. So when you're looking at those products, you think, okay, why is it that the versions that are less toxic, that pose a lower risk, are being made available in other parts of the world, but the inferior version remains here in
Right.
the U.S.
Yeah. And so how do you think the consumer attitudes toward food chemicals and additives are changing? And, how should industry be preparing or go ahead and adjust to accommodate these changes?
Yeah, I think we've seen this coming down the pike for several years, probably over the past 10 to 20 years. It's a movement that began long ago, as consumers became more focused on natural products, organic products. And so I think it's part of that trend where it's evolving from that to getting into, okay, what are these ingredients? Why am I not able to pronounce them? and why am I, why do I not have any idea of what they do? Now, that's not to say that they're all bad, because clearly there are some additives, chemicals that serve a critical role in terms of being a preservative, that sort of thing, and maintaining the safety of the product. But for the most part, you're looking at a lot of ingredients that you can't pronounce, and that becomes frustrating to a consumer. And so I think that's been part of the movement. It's like, okay, I'm looking for more foods that are kind of natural, organic, what have you, to shifting toward, okay, what are these chemicals? What purpose do they serve? If they're bad, clearly some of them are bad. Why can't we get rid of them more effectively as we do in other parts of the world? So I think it's, there are certainly a lot of companies that have been at the forefront of that thinking of, okay, saw this trend, began phasing them out long ago, and saw this train coming, if you will. And, they may not publicize it. I think a lot of companies just, for a variety of reasons, as we all understand, they don't want to publicize anything and just kind of do it quietly, which we totally respect and certainly would encourage industry to do if that's their best option.
And I want to throw out a bonus question to you, and we were talking about this just before we went on stage and started this interview. But so the theme of our opening workshop yesterday was about traceability and the next steps, especially in light of the 30-month postponement to the compliance date that was announced in March by FDA. So my question for you is, given the fact that we know a lot of food companies have been preparing to comply with the rule, with the FSMA 204 original compliance date of January 2026. Again, that's been moved ahead by 30 months. And some hadn't been quite as far along in their journeys. What do you think that this 30-month delay is going to, what opportunities are companies going to seize on with this? And do you think that industry is going to keep moving toward compliance with FSMA 204, or do you think that there's going to be more folks that are going to say, well, maybe we can wait? And what would you like to see?
Yeah, it will depend on the industry, and clearly the bigger businesses have more resource to invest. I'm really concerned about what the 30-month delay will mean. I'm worried that it's a thinly disguised attempt to ultimately try to kill the traceability rule. So I had some very significant concerns when that announcement was delayed, because I know it's just a small segment of the industry that is really trying to push to kill this rule. And I fear that they will use that 30-month period to develop additional excuses as to why it can't move forward. But what's reassuring is there are a lot of companies that are already moving ahead with compliance. They already have a system in place to comply and come up with a meaningful system for traceability. I hope that this delay doesn't stop that from continuing to happen, because clearly there's technology available when you talk to folks, and there are probably some in this room that have the technology to help companies put together a great traceability system. So I hope that delay is used to really leverage that knowledge, as opposed to trying to develop new arguments as to why it's not necessary.
All right. Well, Brian, I want to thank you for sharing your perspectives and insights with our guests here. And it was great to kind of catch up on some of those topics we talked about in your last podcast interview that we did for Food Safety Matters back in February of last year. I think where we were then and where we are now is, it's been many changes since then, and it was interesting to get a chance to talk to you about some of those
I appreciate
things.
being on. Thanks for having me on, Adrienne. I think for consumers, it's really going to be a difficult time trying to figure out what food safety oversight is going to be in this new administration after all of these cuts in staffing and infrastructure, to the ability to conduct kind of basic, meaningful food safety oversight. So thanks for the opportunity to talk it through.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll be doing interviews throughout the rest of the exhibit hall hours. I'll be doing another interview with some folks from Chick-fil-A at 1 o'clock, I think. So make sure you come back here for then. And we'll also be talking with some of our solutions providers. My colleague Bob will be doing a couple interviews. So thanks for listening, and appreciate it.
Don't just hear it, experience the Food Safety Matters podcast live at the Food Safety Summit May 11th through the 14th, 2026 at the Donald E. Stevens Convention Center in Rosemont, Illinois. Food safety professionals meet at the summit to share solutions driving the future of the industry. See the full agenda and register at foodsafetysummit.com.